Martha Evans plunged the shovel into the sun-baked earth, each thrust a desperate prayer for an end she both craved and dreaded. Dust rose in gritty clouds, stinging her eyes, mingling with tears she refused to let fall. Beside her, her children, Samuel, Emily, and little Thomas, watched, their small faces masks of confusion and a dawning, terrible understanding. She was carving their tiny graves into the hostile land, the only mercy she felt she could offer them against the evil that was coming. This lonely patch of ground was to be their final, defiant stand against a merciless frontier. But as the sun bled crimson across the vast horizon, a new shadow stretched long and lean towards them. A lone warrior, appearing like a spirit from the dying light, his silhouette promising not another threat, but a cataclysmic shift in their fate, a change she could never have conceived, one that would alter everything. Life for Martha Evans, a widow in her early 30s, had become a testament to quiet endurance. Her husband, Ben, taken by a lung fever 3 brutal winters ago, had left her with their 3 children and this isolated homestead, a small patch of hope carved into a sprawling, indifferent land. The cabin, built by Ben's own calloused hands, was sturdy but small. Their days were a relentless cycle of chores, coaxing milk from their single, bony cow, tending the meager vegetable patch that fought the arid soil, mending clothes that were more memory than fabric. 10-year-old Samuel, his face already too serious for his age, was learning to track small game with a slingshot Ben had fashioned. Emily, at 8, possessed a quiet diligence, helping with cooking and gathering herbs, her eyes reflecting her mother's weariness. 5-year-old Thomas, a whirlwind of innocent energy, was a constant, bittersweet reminder of laughter in a life that offered few reasons for it. Their world was bounded by the creek that provided life-giving water and the distant, hazy line of the mesas. Redemption Gulch, the nearest collection of souls brave or foolish enough to call themselves a town, was a hard 2-day ride, a journey Martha seldom undertook. Peace was a fragile commodity, hoarded in the quiet moments after the children were asleep, when Martha would sit on the porch, Ben's old rifle across her lap, and listen to the coyotes yip in the distance. She'd made a promise to Ben, a silent vow to protect their children, to make this land yield something of his dream. Her resilience was a deep, still water, her calm exterior a dam holding back a reservoir of grief and a growing, gnawing unease. Lately, that unease had begun to solidify. More than once, she'd seen riders on the high ridge overlooking their valley, figures who lingered too long, their intent unclear, unsettling. Whispers, carried by the wind and the rare, dust-caked traveler, spoke of a man named Caleb Crow Hatcher. They said he had an insatiable hunger for land, a legion of rough men at his back, and a heart as cold and barren as a winter plain. Martha filed these stories away, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. She began to check the rifle's load more often, her gaze sweeping the horizon with a sharper focus. The deceptive tranquility of their valley felt like the calm before a violent storm. One blistering afternoon, as a brassy sun beat down, the storm arrived. 3 riders emerged from the shimmering heat haze, not just observing from the ridge this time, but descending directly towards the cabin. Their horses kicked up plumes of ochre dust, their approach bold, almost contemptuous. Leading them was a man whose presence radiated a chilling authority. He was tall, impeccably dressed in dark fabrics that seemed immune to the trail's grime, his face clean-shaven save for a sharp, dark mustache. His eyes, however, were like chips of obsidian, cold and appraising. This was Caleb Hatcher. He pulled his mount to a halt a few yards from the porch where Martha stood, her hand instinctively resting near the weathered stock of Ben's rifle. Samuel, who had been trying to coax a tune from a crudely made flute, fell silent, his eyes wide and fixed on the intruders. Hatcher surveyed the homestead slowly, his lips curling into a smile that held no warmth, only a predatory assessment. He said, his voice smooth, cultured, yet underscored with a chilling resonance, "Afternoon, ma'am." "Caleb Hatcher. This must be the Evans place." Martha felt a tremor run through her, but kept her voice even. "It is," she replied, her tone giving no invitation. Hatcher's smile broadened, revealing teeth that were unnervingly perfect. "A fine piece of land," he purred, "perhaps too fine for a woman struggling on her own. This is hard country, ma'am, unforgiving for those without adequate protection." His gaze flickered towards Emily and Thomas, who were peeking from behind Martha's skirts. "We manage," Martha stated, her chin lifting a fraction. "I am sure you do, ma'am," Hatcher conceded, his tone dripping with false solicitude. "But I consider myself a good neighbor. I'd be willing to relieve you of this burden. A fair price, naturally. It would save you from a great deal of potential unpleasantness." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threat. One of Hatcher's men, a brutish fellow with a livid scar twisting his lip, let out a low, appreciative chuckle. Martha's jaw tightened. "The land is not for sale, Mr. Hatcher," she declared, her voice unwavering. "It belonged to my husband. It belongs to us." Hatcher's eyes narrowed, the smile vanishing for a heartbeat, revealing a glimpse of the ruthlessness beneath. "Ah, sentiment," he murmured, the smile returning, colder now. "A commendable trait, but it offers little comfort when the wolves are at the door. Consider my offer carefully, Mrs. Evans. I am a patient man, but my patience is not infinite. I shall return." He tipped his hat in a gesture of mock courtesy, then wheeled his horse, his men following like shadows. They rode away, leaving an unnerving silence and the suffocating certainty of future trouble. Martha watched them go, the wood of the porch rail digging into her palm. The first move had been played. The shadow of Hatcher's visit lingered, poisoning the air. The children's laughter became a rare commodity. Samuel took to sleeping with a heavy piece of firewood by his pallet, his young face set in lines of premature responsibility. Martha found herself starting at every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. Sleep offered little respite, her nights filled with visions of Hatcher's icy eyes and the silent menace of his men. She knew fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. Ben had taught her the rudiments of handling the rifle, a skill she'd hoped never to need. Now each evening, after the children were in bed, she practiced, the rifle's kick a brutal reminder of the stakes. Her aim improved with grim determination. She began to patrol the perimeter of their small acreage at dawn and dusk, her senses honed, noting every disturbed stone, every unfamiliar track in the dust. She taught Samuel to read the signs of the land, to move with the silence of a hunter. Emily learned to identify more edible roots and which leaves could soothe fever. These were small, desperate preparations against an overwhelming force, yet the act of doing something, anything, kept the encroaching despair at bay. Her natural quietness deepened, becoming a shield of watchful observation. Beneath the surface, a cold, resolute anger began to build, a mother's primal instinct to protect her young turning into a steely resolve. Then, the subtle campaign of intimidation began, as if Hatcher were methodically tightening a noose. One morning, they awoke to find their small chicken coop broken open, feathers strewn about, their precious few hens gone. Another day, the rope for their well was found deliberately frayed, nearly severed. A carefully tended row of young corn shoots was trampled, a petty act of destruction designed to chip away at their sustenance and their spirit. Once, looking up towards the ridge, Martha saw the glint of sunlight off a spyglass. They were being watched, constantly, their every move scrutinized. The valley, once their sanctuary, now felt like a closing cage. The thought of flight became a persistent whisper in Martha's mind. Could she pack their meager belongings, load the children onto their aging mule, and seek refuge in Redemption Gulch, or perhaps even further afield? But the journey itself was fraught with peril for a lone woman and her children. And this land, this cabin, it was everything they had, the sum of Ben's dreams and their shared life. To abandon it would be to surrender not just their home, but their dignity, their memories. No, she decided, her hands clenching into fists. They would not run. They would stand. But as she gazed at the vast, impassive prairie, a chilling certainty settled within her. This was merely the overture. Hatcher was a patient predator, and he was far from finished. The fragile illusion of normalcy shattered completely as the new moon, Hatcher's implied deadline, approached. Martha had clung to a desperate hope that he might have found other, easier targets, that his threats were mere bluster. But Hatcher was a man who savored the fulfillment of his cruel promises. He didn't come himself, not initially. Two of his most unsavory men, the scar-faced brute and his leering companion, rode into the yard one afternoon, their expressions devoid of any pretense of civility. Samuel, startled, made a move towards the cabin door, but Scarface, with surprising speed, grabbed the boy by the arm, twisting it painfully. Samuel cried out, a sound that ripped through Martha. "Leave him alone," she yelled, her voice hoarse with sudden fury as she stepped forward. The other man, whose eyes held a glint of pure malice, merely laughed. "He needs to learn some manners, ma'am," he sneered. He then sauntered over to the small hutch where Thomas kept his pet rabbit, a fluffy creature named Snow. With a deliberate, vicious stomp of his heavy boot, he crushed the life from the small animal. Thomas's scream was a raw, piercing sound of pure anguish that echoed Martha's own breaking heart. Scarface shoved Samuel towards Martha. "This is Hatcher's final word," he growled, his fetid breath washing over them. "You have until that new moon is gone from the sky. Be off this land, or he'll come back and burn you out. And next time," he added, his gaze lingering cruelly on Emily's tear-streaked face, "we won't be so considerate of the young uns." As a final act of contempt, they unhitched their best horse, the one Martha relied on for any significant travel, and led it away, the callous laughter drifting back as they departed. That night, under the thinnest sliver of the new moon, Hatcher himself appeared. He rode his dark horse to the edge of the clearing, a spectral figure in the gloom. His voice, low and menacing, carried easily to the cabin. "I trust my associates delivered my message, Mrs. Evans. Time is a fleeting thing. I would truly regret it if your children were to suffer from your stubbornness." He waited a moment, as if expecting a reply, then turned his horse and vanished into the darkness. The next morning Martha, her face a stony mask of grim determination, loaded their few remaining essentials into the rickety wagon, hitched to their old, swayback mule. Redemption Gulch was her last, desperate hope. Surely, the law, the community, would offer some sanctuary. But Redemption Gulch proved to be a place of hollow sympathies and palpable fear. The townsfolk listened to her plea, their faces etched with pity, but their eyes darted nervously towards the dusty street, as if expecting Hatcher himself to materialize. The sheriff, a portly man whose badge seemed more an ornament than a symbol of authority, offered platitudes about due process and insufficient manpower. He advised her, his voice barely above a whisper, to be sensible, to avoid antagonizing Mr. Hatcher. It was chillingly clear. Redemption Gulch was either cowed by Hatcher or complicit in his reign. Martha returned to the homestead, the journey back even more arduous, weighed down by the crushing certainty of their isolation. The small ember of hope she had carried to the town had been snuffed out, leaving only the cold ashes of despair. She looked at her children, at Samuel's bruised cheek, at Emily's haunted eyes, at Thomas, who still wept for his lost pet. Hatcher would come. He would take what he wanted, and he would likely destroy them in the process. The frontier, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like the jaws of a closing trap. There was no help, no escape. The days that followed were shrouded in a suffocating gloom. The new moon had vanished, and the full moon, the unspoken final deadline, loomed large and ominous in the night sky. Martha moved through her chores like an automaton, her spirit eroding with each passing hour. The thought of what Hatcher and his men were capable of, the brutal images that assailed her waking moments and haunted her sleep, became unbearable. She had failed Ben's memory. She was failing her children, and in that abyss of hopelessness, a terrible, chilling resolve took root. If she could not shield them from Hatcher's cruelty, she could at least spare them the agony and degradation of his ultimate victory. It was a horrifying thought, A mother's love twisted by despair into its most tragic form, a final, desperate act of protection. She would not let Hatcher have them. So, as the sun began its slow, agonizing descent, painting the western sky in hues of blood and fire, Martha Evans picked up Ben's shovel. She walked towards the solitary cottonwood tree, its leaves rustling like mournful whispers in the hot, dry breeze. And she began to dig. The unforgiving earth resisted, each thrust of the shovel a physical manifestation of her agony. Samuel, Emily, and Thomas watched, their initial bewilderment slowly yielding to a dawning, soul-crushing comprehension. Tears carved clean paths through the dust on their cheeks. Martha said nothing. Words were inadequate for this horror. She just dug, her movements precise, mechanical, her face a mask of impassive grief. One small, shallow depression, then another, a third, heartbreakingly small. She had just braced herself to start the fourth, for herself, when a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a stillness in the rustling leaves, made her look up. A lone rider sat motionless on a painted pony at the edge of the small clearing, observing the grim scene. He was a Navajo warrior, his face weathered, inscrutable, his dark eyes taking in every detail, the weeping children, the woman toiling with such focused despair, the freshly dug, waiting holes. He carried a feathered lance, and a bow slung across his back. This was not Hatcher. This was not one of his men. This was something entirely different, an unknown element in an already impossible equation. A fresh wave of fear, sharp and cold, pierced through Martha's numbness, followed swiftly by an overwhelming weariness. Was this, then, how it would end? Not at Hatcher's hands, but by some other, unforeseen violence? Claw, the Navajo warrior, had been trailing Caleb Hatcher's men for many suns. His hunt was not born of any knowledge of Martha Evans or her children. His reasons were ancient, sacred. Hatcher's band, in their rapacious quest for plunder, had trespassed upon the hallowed burial grounds of Claw's ancestors, desecrating graves, stealing artifacts of spiritual significance. Such an affront to the spirits could not be ignored. Claw was the answer to their silent cries for justice. His relentless pursuit had led him into this valley. He'd seen the thin plume of smoke from the cabin chimney, and had approached with the stealth of a desert cat. Then he had seen her, the woman, her movements heavy with an unspeakable sorrow, digging. The children, their small bodies racked with sobs. And the graves, raw wounds in the earth. Claw, a man inured to the harsh realities of survival, to the constant presence of death, felt a strange stirring. This was not the grief of ordinary loss. This was the abyss. He saw not merely a settler, an occupier of land, but a fellow human being pushed to the very precipice of existence. He dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace, his movements conveying no threat. Martha froze, the shovel clutched in her hand like a weapon, her knuckles bone-white. The children huddled together, their cries choked off by this new, imposing presence. Claw advanced, stopping a respectful distance away. For a long moment he was silent, his gaze shifting from Martha's ravaged face to the pitiful, shallow graves, then to the trail leading away from the homestead, a trail bearing the fresh, distinctive tracks of Hatcher's shod horses. He knew those tracks intimately. When his eyes returned to Martha, they held not judgment, but a flicker of something akin to understanding, a recognition of a shared adversary. He spoke, his voice low, the English words heavily accented, chosen with care. "Why you dig?" he asked, his gesture encompassing the tragic scene. Martha's throat felt constricted. The words came out raspy, broken. "Men," she managed. "Bad men. They come. Take everything. Hurt my children." Her voice failed her. No escape. A muscle tightened in Claw's jaw, the only outward sign of his reaction. He looked towards the west, the direction from which Hatcher's men would inevitably approach. He had seen their careless trail, their arrogant disregard for concealment. He pointed. "Hatcher?" he asked, the name a harsh syllable. Martha nodded, a single, convulsive movement. A spark of surprise ignited in her weary eyes. This warrior, he knew Hatcher. Claw grunted, a sound of grim affirmation. He then gestured to himself, then towards the graves, and slowly, emphatically, shook his head. No. Then, he pointed again towards the unseen Hatcher, then back to himself, and nodded once, decisively. His meaning, despite the chasm of language and culture, was starkly, astonishingly clear. He was not here because of her immediate plight, not directly. But Hatcher, Caleb Hatcher, was his quarry too. He saw the tracks. He saw her despair. He saw the graves not as an act of madness, but as the ultimate symptom of Hatcher's poisonous presence. An unspoken pact formed in that moment, a fragile alliance forged in the crucible of mutual desperation and a shared desire for retribution. He saw not a helpless victim, but a woman pushed to the edge, a woman who might still possess a spark of fight if fanned by the slightest breeze of hope. This was the unforeseeable intervention, the twist of fate that Martha, in her darkest hour, could never have imagined. The last vestiges of sunlight surrendered to the encroaching twilight. Claw wasted no time on words. He was a man of swift, decisive action. With gestures and a few carefully chosen words, a plan began to coalesce. Claw understood Hatcher's brutal tactics, his overconfidence, the way he would likely approach. Martha, in turn, knew every inch of her homestead, the strengths of the cabin's log walls, the vulnerabilities of its approaches. Claw indicated the cabin, then made motions of aiming and hiding. Martha understood. She and the children were to be inside, defended. He, however, would use the terrain, the gathering darkness, the element of surprise. He examined Ben's repeater rifle, nodding once, a gesture of grudging respect for its well-maintained condition. He showed Martha the optimal firing positions from the cabin's narrow windows. Samuel, his earlier terror now replaced by a grim, focused intensity, watched Claw's every move, absorbing the warrior's silent instructions. Emily, though still trembling, helped Martha drag their heavy plank table to barricade the door. Little Thomas, confused but sensing the urgent shift in atmosphere, was hidden beneath the bed, told it was a crucial game of silence. As impenetrable darkness cloaked the valley, Claw seemed to dissolve into the shadows beyond the small circle of firelight from their hearth, becoming an unseen part of the night itself. Martha waited, the rifle a cold, heavy weight in her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The silence stretched, taut and electric. Then a sound, the faint, rhythmic thud of approaching hooves, growing steadily louder. Hatcher was coming. They materialized as dark, menacing shapes against the starlit horizon. At least 5 riders, moving with the swagger of men expecting an easy victory. They spread out slightly as they neared the cabin, Hatcher's imposing figure at their head. Evans. His voice boomed, sharp with impatience. Show yourself. We don't have all night for this charade. No response from the cabin. Martha pressed her cheek against the cool stock of the rifle, her breathing shallow but controlled. Stubborn woman, Hatcher snarled, loud enough for his voice to carry clearly. All right, boys, if she insists on doing this the hard way. He was cut off mid-sentence as an arrow, appearing as if from nowhere, thudded into the chest of the rider, to his immediate right. The man let out a choked gasp and pitched sideways from his saddle, landing with a heavy, sickening thud. Pandemonium erupted. Ambush. One of Hatcher's men screamed, his hand clawing for his pistol. Before he could draw, a second arrow transfixed his shoulder, eliciting a howl of pain as his weapon clattered to the ground. Hatcher roared an oath, spinning his horse, his eyes frantically scanning the darkness for the unseen assailant. But Claw was a ghost, a whisper in the night, striking with deadly precision and then vanishing. There in the cabin, Hatcher bellowed, wrongly assuming the attack originated from within. Burn them out. 2 of his men, regaining a measure of composure, spurred their horses forward, crudely made torches already flaring in their hands. The flickering light illuminated their faces, making them stark targets against the gloom. The crack of Martha's rifle split the night. One of the charging men cried out, clutching his leg as he tumbled from his horse. The second man faltered, his momentary hesitation fatal. Claw, materializing from the shadows beside him like an avenging spirit, brought his war club down with swift, brutal force. The man collapsed without a sound. Hatcher, now with only one of his cronies still mounted, was incandescent with rage. He fired his revolver wildly in the direction of the cabin, bullets thudding harmlessly into the thick log walls. "Come out and fight, you cowardly dogs!" he screamed, his voice cracking with fury. Inside, Martha reloaded, her hands shaking but her movements surprisingly steady. Samuel, displaying a courage far beyond his years, peered through a narrow slit between the logs, calling out Hatcher's position. "He's near the woodpile, Ma. He's reloading." Suddenly, Hatcher's last remaining man let out a gurgling cry and slumped over his horse's neck. Claw had dealt with him. Now it was only Hatcher. He stood alone, a solitary figure in the dim, torchlit yard, his face a mask of disbelief and thwarted malice. His carefully constructed world of intimidation was crumbling around him. He saw Claw step out from behind the water trough, lance held at the ready, a figure of implacable justice. "You!" Hatcher hissed, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps just primal fear, in his eyes. He raised his pistol, aiming for the warrior. But Martha was quicker. Her rifle barked once more. The bullet tore through Hatcher's gun arm, sending his pistol spinning into the dust. He shrieked, a sound of pure agony and frustrated rage. Claw advanced, his movements fluid, relentless. The final confrontation was short, decisive, and brutal. Caleb Crow Hatcher, disarmed, wounded, and alone, was no match for the Navajo warrior's skill and righteous fury. There, in the dirt yard of the homestead he had sought to conquer, his reign of terror ended with a chilling finality. Justice, stark and unyielding, had been served under the vast, indifferent expanse of the frontier sky. Martha slowly lowered her rifle, a long, shuddering breath escaping her lips. The nightmare was over. The first tentative fingers of dawn were stretching across the eastern horizon when a fragile peace settled over the valley. Hatcher lay still in the dust. His men, those who hadn't fallen, had vanished into the night at the first undeniable sign of their leader's downfall, melting away like morning mist. Claw stood over Hatcher's form for a silent moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Then he turned away, his grim purpose fulfilled. Martha emerged from the cabin, Samuel and Emily clinging to her, their small faces pale but resolute. Little Thomas, mercifully, was still asleep under the bed, shielded from the worst of the night's violence. The yard was a scene of grim aftermath, but the air, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, tasted clean, free of the cloying taint of Hatcher's menace. Claw met Martha's gaze across the bloodied ground. No words were exchanged, none were necessary. He had come seeking his own justice, and in doing so, had become their unforeseen savior. Martha offered a slow, profound nod, her eyes conveying a depth of gratitude that transcended language. Claw, in return, gave a slight, almost imperceptible inclination of his head, an acknowledgment of her own courage, of the desperate fight she had waged. He stooped to retrieve his arrows then, with the same quiet dignity with which he had arrived. He mounted his pony. Without a backward glance, he rode east, towards the rising sun, a solitary figure disappearing into the vastness of the land, perhaps to honor the spirits his actions had avenged. Later that day Martha, with Samuel's solemn assistance, attended to the grim task of dealing with the dead. The shallow grave she had dug for her family, for herself, remained empty, stark, poignant reminders of the precipice upon which they had stood. They would not be filled. Instead, they would serve as an enduring testament to their ordeal, to the moment when hope had nearly been extinguished, and to the unexpected intervention that had pulled them back from the abyss. News of Caleb Hatcher's demise spread, first as a hesitant rumor, then as a wave of disbelieving relief throughout the territory. A few days later, a small, somber delegation from Redemption Gulch, including the visibly chastened sheriff, made the journey to the Evans homestead. They brought supplies, offered assistance in repairing the minor damage to the cabin, their voices tinged with a newfound respect and a palpable shame for their earlier cowardice. Martha accepted their offerings with quiet grace. She didn't need their pity, but their respect, earned in the crucible of terror, was a welcome balm. The frontier remained a harsh, demanding land, but for Martha Evans and her children, it was now irrevocably home. They had faced its darkest aspects and had not only endured but had discovered a strength, a resilience they hadn't known they possessed. The valley, once a place of encroaching fear, began to echo again with the sounds of children's laughter, tentative at first, then growing stronger, and with the quiet, determined industry of a woman tending her land, a land consecrated not just by Ben's sweat and dreams, but by her own unyielding courage, a mother's fierce love, and the unexpected, transformative alliance with a warrior who had sought only his own measure of justice. A hard-won peace had settled over the Evans homestead, as tenacious and enduring as the prairie grass that bent in the wind but never broke.